Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be looking at the top 8 decks from the Lille Regional Championships, as well as the day 1 and 2 breakdown, and a brief discussion about my day with Miraidon, actually, of all things, which is probably a surprise to some of you. Let's start with the day 1 and 2 breakdown. There is still one more tournament. We have Toronto this weekend. In this format, this is probably going to be the last video I focus on the 151 meta, and from tomorrow it's going to be Rift stuff, so hopefully that's going to be quite interesting. I know there's already been content on a few different channels, but I like to think that we put a lot of work into our new set stuff. We've been testing it for a couple of weeks, so hopefully we have a decent grip on the metagame and can provide some good insight there. But enough of that, let's talk about the day 1 analysis, and it's not too surprising to me that we have a really condensed top 6, really, where there's Gardevoir, Charizard, and Lost Zone, all pretty much the same percentage. Like, there's 5 more Gardevoir players in the room compared to Charizard and Lost Zone. And when we're talking about an 850-player tournament, it's more or less the same percentage. So those seem to be the most popular. I'm not surprised to see Guardy and Lost Zone way up there. Quite surprising to still see Charizard, because it's been a couple of tournaments where it failed to top 8, and it's still being one of the most popular contenders. I do think matchup-wise, it doesn't have too much to fear in terms of what's around it. I think Chien-Pao probably the worst matchup among the things on the page here, but there weren't exactly a huge amount of Mews to be farming. Now, Mew did end up doing very well this tournament, which we'll get back to, but for me it's a little bit surprising to still see it up there in that 13% range. I do think it's still one of the easier archetypes to play alongside like Miraidon and Lugia. I would say of the 6 in front of you, those are the 3 sort of easier to play builds, so maybe that also has some percentage going for it, in that Charizard is just a big bulky dude and asks questions of the opponent in terms of how they navigate their own prize map. Otherwise you just come in and swing with your big EX, and that can be a challenge for a number of archetypes. So I do think that could be something going behind Charizard's overall popularity compared to Lost Zone, Box, and Guardy. Lost Zone seems to be like the best deck in the game. It's already won a couple of regionals with the Kyogre build, but it is like the most difficult, but also you have to remember, going into Lille, we'd just seen 4 colorless Lugias in the previous top 8, so I'm still a little bit surprised to see it holding that sort of 13% range. Then we have Miraidon, still fairly inflated in that 12%, again, one of the easier decks to pilot in the game, and possibly some players trying to capitalize on the Lugia uprising from the previous week, or just saying that you're an aggressive fast deck. I think you're actually pretty okay into Guardy and Charizard. I played a number of them this weekend, and if you are playing the Judge and Iono Path package, I think you can race these fairly effectively. It's kind of being talked down by a number of other channels and stuff that I see, but I think its only true bad matchup is Lost Zone Box, really, which is still a risk to bring, obviously, because Lost Box you'd expect to still be among the top archetypes, as we see here. So there are threats for Miraidon, but pretty much every deck in this top 6 has a matchup that they're looking to dodge, so it's not too different to other decks in the game right now. Lugia did pick up a little bit of percentage. I would have expected it to hit more towards that sort of 12%, but some people are still holding off on it, and there is Chien-Pao up in 9% as well, stealing possibly some meta share away from like Mew, for example, which is quite surprising, but it seems like everyone's quite happy to play the 60 that's been presented to us with enough success from Chien-Pao at this point. Let's have a look at the day 2 conversion then. Some interesting stuff going on here. Chien-Pao did pretty well. Lost Zone Box did obviously very well with its conversion, with 20% of the day 2 decks overall. Guardia held strong. Charizard held pretty well as well. Miraidon didn't do that fantastically. Lugia really did quite poorly, which is a surprise because it wasn't actually that popular overall. And with so many Lost Zone Boxes rising to the top, possibly it was just one of those situations where the Lugias couldn't keep up on those higher tables in the opening stage. So Lost Zone kind of raised its way out of those records where they could hit any Lugias any longer, and then they just have a really good run from then on. And Giratina actually made a bit of a comeback with 10% of our day 2, despite it not being on that day 1 graphic. Possibly just the fact that you have some higher damage output potential means you're okay into those Lugia matchups that little bit more. Even having that Star Requiem is going to get the Charizard EX, which can be a struggle sometimes for Lost Zone Box players. So yeah, seeing a small uprising in Giratina. I don't think it's going to start to become this like day 1 10% deck all over again. I think it's going to still sit sub 5%, but there is still decent logic behind the Giratina, especially because it seems like some of the most successful ones we saw into day 2 were going as high as like 4 copies of Path and like 2 Rocks, 2 Iona, really disruptive builds. And I think that's just strong in the game right now. It's part of the reason why I played Miraidon EX myself going into this tournament. I just liked having Judge Path as an option in the game. And it's also kind of what was being discussed in the previous week's results, where Arc kind of made a bit of a comeback, and possibly a lot of that came down to just having Judge Path in the deck list. So Tina can do a very similar thing with Rock's Path or Iono Path, which is really strong into the Chempals, the Guardies, and even just having hand disruption against Lost Box is really solid. And obviously Path is very good against Charizard as well. Typically it's best alongside a Judge in that scenario precisely, but your attackers are so good into Charizard, it doesn't really matter. You can just kind of throw Paths out there as and when, which is really solid. So yeah, a really interesting day 1 and 2 spread. Let's have a look at the deck lists themselves then. Consta, who has been playing Mew very well actually over the last few months. They got a regional 2nd place last year and also got a top 16 at Worlds, and I think tied their winning in to actually make top 8. So definitely a very strong Mew player. Once again, bringing back the fusion-based build. I think really in terms of tech Pokemon, more people were going towards the Spiritomb side of things because of the DTE Mew prevalence, thanks to Rowan's DTE list from a few weeks ago. So playing Fusion seemed to be the safer choice, and it seems to have really done well. I feel like even with the Fusion build coming up against Charizard, you feel quite unfavored. I think because, again, Charizard is still going to be around that sort of 10% mark. You can take a bad matchup with basically any deck in the game right now and simply dodge it or like scrape a tie or something out of the game if you just happen to hit 1 or 2 of them, and then you're pretty okay. And I think Charizard's one of the better ones to do that with, because we've seen that Charizard has failed to really get to those top tables a lot. So Consta, I think, actually hit only 1 in the day looking at their PokeStats Live page, and actually was able to beat it. So that's really interesting. Playing a very similar 60 to their Worlds list, actually, where they still have that 1 Avery in their deck list. This can be good for Mirror Match. It can be annoying for Gardevoir players. Basically, any setup deck doesn't like to see this card. Has the aggressive lines from Ice-Q and Meloetta. Ice-Q, of course, giving you that option through Spiritomb, so was likely expecting those tech inclusions. Still has Rocks and Judge for some hand disruption, but outside of that, it's nothing too far-fetched that we haven't seen previously. Has Lost City, has Path of the Peak, has a couple stadium bounces, in addition to the vacuums, which is just great hand thinning throughout the entire game to help pop off with your Genesects throughout the entire time. Essentially, Mew was being respected by some players, but I think more so leaning towards the Spiritomb side of things. I think most Lost Boxes are playing Drap, or cutting Drap, I should say, and even if they're playing Spiritomb, it's much less of a headache for these kinds of builds. So I think that's a big reason why Consta did well, but also he's just a really efficient and strong and experienced Mew player, so that's also a huge contributing factor, and congratulations to them. We have Arthur in 2nd place with a really interesting Lost Zone box. I actually got to speak to them fairly in depth about this as we had dinner on the Saturday night together. They're playing the Cross Switcher Cancelling Cologne package. Obviously, in mirror match situations, the main hand disruptors are just Roxannes against each other. So in the mirror, you have a really nice play where you can make a Greninja happen, even if they have Manaphy developed, and that can sort of cause a surprise factor, double prize turn, which is really good for mirror match situations. It can be really annoying if it ever comes together in like the Gardevoir matchup or the Chempao matchup, these sorts of things. It may seem like quite a high roll, but we know that with enough Flower Selectings, Choruses, even the Forest Seal Stone play, you can make these hero plays come off, even if it is just a one-time use of the cross switchers. So I think that's really cool to see overall. The one thing that kind of surprised me was playing Cross Cologne made me think that Pokestop would be like a no-brainer support stadium card, I should say. But having Beach and Artisan in here instead looks pretty good. The Spiritomb looking very intelligent as well for the weekend. There was a decent amount of Lugia where you're being disruptive against, you're being annoying for Charizard players as well. And of course, you're giving yourself some coverage against Mew. Obviously, more people were expecting DTE Mew going into this tournament, where it would have been far more effective, and the Fusion build still has a chance. So there is going to be that debate ongoing with Turbo Lost Box if they keep Tomb and have the more versatile options of being a headache for Lugias, which is already one of your worst matchups, and Zard, or you just go, I'm going to play Drapion and give myself just that easier prize map against the Mew players. I think it's a bit of a toss-up whether or not you want to have that really good Mew matchup and still struggle through the others, or have the Tomb to be that sort of catch-all, but is slightly less effective against Fusion builds. definitely an interesting discussion going into the next week. I wonder if people are going to kick on with this cross Cologne combo, because it does feel like it's at least a good mirror option, but is also really good against, sometimes it's Charizard, sometimes it's Gardevoir, based on how their setup is going, and can even like hurt Chien-Pao at times. So yeah, really, really solid. Also playing that Ditto. We've seen this in a couple of the highest placing lost boxes over the last few weeks, so it's seeming more and more the case that just having this higher percentage makes a lot of sense here, just to give yourself the good lead in the deck for those extra flower selecting percentages. It always feels weird to me when you're not maximizing the actual ball search counts. And again, if you are thinking about putting a Pokestop in, possibly Ditto just becomes Nestball for those higher ratios of hitting off stops. So that would be a small debate for me, but otherwise it's a very solid turbo lost box list. We have Owen Cowman in top 4 with the straightforward Chien-Pao. I think it's actually the exact same 60 that we've seen from Grant and a number of other top players piloting it over the last few weeks. So it seems like this is the list to go for. There's very little chaff. It's all just trying to go quick, have great ratios for Pokestop, and have the power spikes of your Hailblade one-hit KOs or your Greninja Cologne plays. So lots of cross-switcher Cologne doing well in this tournament. Seems to be a really good combo right now in the game. Patrick Bartosevic was our Lugia player, has been playing it for a number of tournaments. I think has got some previous top 32s and 64s with the archetype, this time rocking the colorless build. Doesn't have the Charizard in here, which I'm personally a big fan of. I think it gives you much more percentage into Chen and into Miraidon. So small surprise there to not see it come in, but does have the Luxray reversal package, has Weirdeer, has Mew, and triple Snorlax. And outside of that, it's just a very consistent shell of Lugia trying to get the job done, and you're just kind of leaning into the versatility of your attackers to sort of make it all happen. Alberto Conti was one of the Giratina believers, despite its lack of performance in the last few weeks, was deciding to pilot this archetype. And it's what I mentioned earlier, actually. Alberto was one of the more disruptive base Tinas out here with the quad path, the 2 Iono, the 2 Roxanne. Seems like it's just really solid in the game right now. Having lots of disruption keeps you in so many games. You can try and take away engine pieces with Sableye, of course, with Lost Mine in combination with these disruptors. So you do have a solid way of racing. I do still feel worried about the Lugia matchup, but sometimes just paths get you there. I think a Spiritomb coming into this Tina would make a lot of sense to give yourself even more coverage against the Lugia, and also give you some coverage into Mew, which I think is also a matchup once again worth respecting. But I do really like the simplicity of this deck list, just to try and make the deck do what it wants to as often as possible, and give yourself these surpluses to make sure that you don't have headaches of lost zoning every single turn of the game. Gabor was playing the DTE base build of Mew with the double grabber Luxray V package that we saw popularized by Rowan a couple of weeks ago, and I believe there's not too many changes outside of that. Maybe just some flicking around, I think, playing a Lost City in here, which wasn't in Rowan's list. Gabor did face one Charizard during the day and was able to win their game, so always nice to see that the package can come off and does work sometimes against the Lizards, so you can still get there with DTE Mew. Obviously the question now becomes, with a couple Mew making top 8s, is it safe to play this archetype, or are there going to be Spiritombs out in their droves coming into Toronto? Hermione has had great success with Goodra in the past and is once again bringing it to a top 8 placement, which is fantastic to see. Seems very similar to the senior list from America, where we have the Zamazenta and the Spiritomb in here to give you some coverage into some of your weaker matchups. The Zam really helps out against the Chien-Pao, where the Goodra is less effective, and even to an extent against the Giratina players, where you sometimes even forego the Goodra altogether, and the Spiritomb is giving you some coverage into the Mew matchup. Every now and then it comes into play against the Lugia matchup as well if you want to have some extra disruption. But the list seems fairly streamlined, straightforward. Interesting tidbit, this is what I was testing a huge amount going into this tournament, and I was actually too scared to pull the trigger on this list, but it's actually 59 cards the same as what I would have played, so kind of kicking myself that I didn't back up the list. Because Hermione has shown that you can have a really deep run with Goodra. I think the matchup spread for Goodra is super appealing. The main thing holding me back from playing Goodra, and the main reason I didn't pull the trigger on this deck list, is the consistency is somewhat of a headache for me. It feels similar to Giratina, but you don't have Abyss Seeking to fall back on, which really put me off the deck list. But I think Hermione basically came to the same conclusions I did with the 60 itself, and was happy enough to just say that your matchups are good enough that you can always be fairly happy going into the field. One of the things I find most intriguing about Goodra and why it was so high on my radar was that you completely flip the Lugia matchup from being unfavored if you're pretty much all the other Lost Box variants into very favored if you're up against the colorless build, because Rolling Iron is so annoying. It makes all their Snorlax so ineffective, and their damage output is just awful. They can't really play around Moisture Style very well at all. You can even go double Goodra in that matchup if you truly want to, because they don't even have many good Gust plays around you. So yeah, I think what's super enticing about Goodra specifically, and why I was metagaming for it so hard, was that you get the benefits of Cram and Sableye, and even Moonlight Shuriken very well supported in this list. But rather than having to fear Lugia, you're actually quite happy to see it. So wouldn't surprise me if there have been other players who have taken on this list or have tested it before, now getting more encouragement going into Toronto, because I actually think it's super well placed heading into next week. After a 9th place finish in Barcelona, Fabien Puyol comes back with a top 8 finish with Gardevoir this time. They've been sticking with the one copy of Champs Fest over the last couple of tournaments, though seeming to enjoy having the 4 stadium bounces and just sticking with more power draw supporters, even having the Zinnia's Resolve in here to give yourself extra discard synergy and give yourself extra dig, versus a research where there are often times where your hand is locked from this card based on, you know, just having a rod or another piece in hand that you can't really throw away. So it seems like Fabien has constructed a really nice list which works for them, and Gardevoir continues to just be one of the most consistent decks in the game, especially with having more deep dig supporters in the deck compared to just having workers. You have these versatile options, Champions Festival being one that can really help out not only against Lost Zone Box but also against the likes of Lugia, alongside these reversal energies, just to give your Brainwave more opportunities to get into the game. So I did just want to end on my run. I ended up playing Miraidon, partly because I was pulling my hair out with Goodra so much, and I gave myself like a week left, and I actually didn't have enough time to really playtest much more of Goodra, so I couldn't feel that confident in myself because I hadn't played enough games with it. So I actually jumped ship onto Miraidon thinking it was one of the more simple decks to play, and that certainly is the case. And that's mostly because I was focusing so much on Paradox Risk the last couple of weeks. That's where most of my playtesting and energy has been put towards. So I wanted to play a more streamlined, simplistic deck where I knew there was really good 60s already out there that I could just copy-paste and try and play to my best ability. You can see my day one run was pretty interesting. I faced 5 Gardevoir builds, including Mateus, who was playing the Gardevoir Bennett that was loved on stream by many people. Super intriguing list. And I tied that match up basically because game 1 I was figuring out what his deck does, and ended up losing to a Calamitous Wasteland that locked me out of my Raichu endgame that I tried to line up to close out the game. It was an Iono Wasteland combo that meant that my energy with Squawkabilly and my 0 retreat cost Flying Pikachu that I would send into the active to be the pivot before I went Flaffy Raichu, you know, endgame from working, because I would send up either of those Pokemon, they'd have the +1 retreat cost, and I basically got Iono'd into completely nothing. I hit like Nestball, Miraidon from the 3 cards from that Iono, and I just completely lost tempo from that point, and they turned into an aggressive Guardy deck from that point onwards, and that's how I lost game 1. But I was able to get over the line in game 2 when I saw more of the tricks of their deck. They also had a pretty awkward research where they didn't hit any Curliers turn 2 as well, which kind of helped me actually end up with a tie in that matchup. But a super interesting, definitely the most interesting game I had of the day, because it really felt like in that game 1 I was getting so supremely outplayed while I was trying to figure out what the heck was happening in that matchup. I did lose round 1 to a Charizard. I remember game 1, this went loss, win, loss. I open with Pikachu Pass, which was really sad going first. You really like to bank, even just one attachment against Charizard is so good, just because every energy matters when you're up against this deck, because you will have to Raichu at one point during the game. But I opened all supporters and double path, which felt really bad, because you can't really insta-path Charizard, just because I will still need my own Miraidon to get my setup. So I literally had to pass into them. Then turn 2, I could use an Arven to actually initiate a prize race, because they led with NTV and got double VIP pass, so filled their board. So I could have insta-punished an NTV start from them, because I play the Pogo Zapdos. But I whiff the generator that I had to Forest Seal Stone for, so because I went Arven, Nestball, Forest, and then Nestballed Miraidon, got the chaps out. My top deck was actually energy, so I had energy attachment, so all I needed was the 1 energy from generator to initiate a race, and I think I would have won that game 1 pretty easily. And then in game 3, I prized double Raikou, which really put a strain on my energy resources, which meant into the late game I had to try and weave in a Flying Pikachu V attack before loading up a Raichu over 2 turns, and I flipped tails on the Pikachu. So literally it came down to a game 3 coin flip in this first round, which kind of sucked and really put the fear of God in me, thinking that, oh boy, this whole day is going to come down to whether or not I can hit Thundershock flips at different times in the tournament. Got very lucky in the mirror where I just set up better than my opponent in both games and was over really, really quickly. Against Kyle, it went win-loss-loss, I think. No, it went loss-win-win. I do have some notes on my phone here. I whiffed a turn on attack against them in my loss game, so was forced into a fast charge, and then as the game progresses, I'm never able to combine a path with a Judge or Iono, and you kind of need to make that happen and make it stick. It feels like it's such a copium game plan, but because you go so aggressive knocking out Curliers, Rolts, etc., they actually don't have that much onboard draw as they would like most of the time. So even if you are just going for a Judge or Iono play mid-game, they still only really get to see like 6 cards more often than not before they have to hit like a Worker or a Stadium. But I was never able to combine the Hand Disruption with the Stadium, which was a shame. In game 2, my generators really popped off, which really opened up. I think I was able to double Raichu that game, which was pretty insane. And I think they also... Actually, I think they led a Zacian, or at least had to weave in a Zacian, which really made my prize map a lot easier. Game 3 was super scuffed as well, where we were both like attached passing for a couple turns, but I was able to get the better end of luck there, where I think, again, a path just stuck for probably too long. I was able to beat another Charizard. This was a build that played Arc and Pidgeot, so it meant their pop-offs were even higher. That was a pretty tough series, but we were able to win that 2-0, mostly because I just happened to get into early bosses, and if you early boss Pidgeot, their deck really does suffer, where they're having to go through the active Pokemon so often, and if you're able to weave in Judge or Iono whilst getting a Zapdos attack in, you can actually two-shot one of the Charizards, and it doesn't affect your prize map, so that's what I was able to do in both of those games, actually. Like I said, my tie was super interesting, where I was basically learning what their deck was capable of. In the second game, I basically was just able to capitalize on my item usage that little bit quicker, because they didn't cycle through their deck as much with not finding their Curlies in time, so they were kind of having bit part turns a little bit more, which gave me the window of opportunity to close the game. Really cool deck list, though. If I cared more about this format, because we're coming to the end of it, I would have put way more time into this deck, because it was super cool to see, and they had a really good finish with 9-3-3, not bad at all. Now I face another Guardy. Most people say Guardy's like a really bad matchup for this deck, but I think it's fine. And what was cool was it's one of the more interesting matchups where I actually have more decision making compared to some games with Miraidon where you're not making that many decisions, you're just kind of just outright race. Whereas against the Guardy, you're really having to time your judges, your Ionos, your bosses, and the timing and the method in which you attack, because you have so many options of what to attack with, is what will define how the games go. So there are times when I'm thinking about weaving in the Flaffy attack, definitely trying to weave in the Zapdos attack when I can, to try and offset their prize race, because you're often going ahead with Raikou early pressure, and you're just trying to make that work, but you're also trying to do it alongside the hand disruptors and the paths, of course, as well. So you can see that I actually did pretty well against the Guardies overall, beating 3 of them, tying to 1, which was not even just like a standard Guardy, and losing to one of the standard Guardies, which I'll get to in a moment. But yeah, we were able to beat this next one. This was, what was it, round 6? I think most of these are going like loss, win, win. I think in my loss, I led Zapdos, because I didn't know what I was up against, and I didn't want to lead Raichu just based on my hand complexion. But when I go for like my first research, just having a 2 retreat Pokemon was what scuffed me from having early pressure altogether, which is a little bit of a shame, but I was able to pull out the other 2 games. My round 7 was against Eric Puyol, who was the brother of Fabian, who just made top 8, so definitely a solid player, and was playing a very path-heavy Tina with some good hand disruption. This is one of your worst matchups, especially if they just kind of pop off, and that happened in game 1. Game 2, I was able to early aggress down enough Comfey so that they missed the sort of 7 threshold on turn 2, and then I was able to gust up a Tina and just go very far ahead in terms of like board state and prize race. I remember having enough generators early game that hit that I was able to threaten the turn 2 Miraidon to stop them from going Jet Energy Abyss Seek, which meant then the following turn they wouldn't get to the 7 threshold, so I was able to win the second game. Then game 3 they have like VIP, do some selects, end on path, and that ending of path really scuffed me over, obviously, because my list was playing paths themselves, so I had no bounce to path, and it meant that I basically ended up having to just go for an early Raichu fast charge play, and it just put me in a really weird spot. I was eventually able to get into a research, and then I basically just draw all the Pokemon that I would like to tandem unit out, which meant that I basically didn't do anything that turn. I just kind of bench stuff, but didn't really have like an energy attachment that turn, a generator or the switch card or whatever else I needed to keep up in tempo. So they checkmated me really nicely in the third game. Edwin was kind of the sad loss of the day, because obviously I couldn't lose any more from this stage. I had to win out if I wanted to make day 2 after my loss against Tina, and obviously I lost early on in the day. But I can't really have many complaints about the loss against Eric. Against Lucas, I feel like I had the tough rub of the green. Also, I think against Edwin, I had a really tough rub of the green where I win the first game, playing like fairly well. They did have a slow start, admittedly, but in games 2 and 3, Edwin actually makes me go first, which I think is reasonable as Guardy, actually, just so that you don't brick yourself and give yourself as many options to find Ralts early as possible, so you get your own setup, which I think is completely fine. But I go just Mareep attach past game 2, which like takes away all my early tempo, and then I even miss attack because my generator number 1 misses. So I don't hit turn 2 against him, which just really sucks. And then in game 3, it happens even worse because I have the Zapdos lead with the attach pass as well. So Edwin really kind of got away with one after I won like the first game in 15 to 20 minutes. I thought I was at the very least coming out with a tie with that one, but things just really snowballed out of my control. Actually, in game 3, they prized double Curlier, but my start was so slow that I couldn't even punish it. They ended up still having refinement, and 2 rare candied Guardies because they were able to just like slowly build the board against me while I was just really not pressurizing. And Miraidon 100% needs to pressurize. So Edwin, very good player, obviously went deep into the tournament, and their list was really good as well. I can't really knock Edwin at all, and also made me go first, so put themselves in the position to make me brick, if that makes sense, or just make me have a less explosive turn. But also I had really low variance in games 2 and 3 against him, which was a little bit of a shame. So my run was ended in that round 8, and then we faced another Guardi in round 9. I have a really, really big high roll in game 1 where I think I hit double energy on generator 3 times in this game, so the checkmate is just way too easy with Raichu in those situations, especially if I'm able to like generate onto Zapdos, I think, for a turn, which then let me weave that in as a single prize Pokemon, giving them the question mark of whether they boss or play Iono. And in this case, Francisco wanted to put themselves in a 2-turn attack win condition, so went for a boss play while I'm holding boss for game, because I can just tutor out Raichu and do the thing. So was able to win that game 1 pretty convincingly, and then in the game 2, they drew 6 from a judge, and they just decided to pack it up from there. I feel like we could have kept playing, honestly. And I wasn't like calling for a judge at the time, but he just instantly packed up. I think he was done with the day, had a bit of a low roll in the first game, and I was high roll in game 1, and then in game 2 he has that sort of like head slap moment where he's not really thinking properly, so just packed it all up. But Francisco's a really nice guy. We've chatted before a few times, and it just happens sometimes, and after 9 rounds of Pokemon and it's not been your day, I can see why. He just wanted to pack it up after that head slap moment. But yeah, Miraidon I think was a pretty solid choice, and I do think it's an okay choice going into the next tournament. I think there's this myth that it's really bad into Guardi and really bad into Zard. I think they put you on the clock, and obviously Guardi draws more cards than you, and you have to be quite comfortable playing with low hand sizes as Miraidon, and trying to get your extra cards of fleet-footed here and there, and really try and time your Forest Seal Stone. There are definitely situations where if you can not use Forest Seal Stone and have it as an on-board Iono-proofing mechanism, which I use quite a good amount of times against the Guardi, it can be really massive as well. So there are definitely a few tricks you can do with Miraidon, definitely weaving in Zapdos or Flaffy as an attacker, depending on how much damage they've put onto their Gardevoir. Those can be really massive plays. But yeah, I think the deck's really cool, and I think it's pretty okay. Definitely going into the next set as well with Paradox Rift, so it's definitely going to be on my radar. I know I didn't end up too well, just top 56, nothing special, but I've had a really slow start to the season, so the first regional that I've played in, happy to at least walk away with some points. Once again, congrats to everyone else in the top 8, some great results there, some really cool innovative lists as well coming into the latter stages of this little format, but now our attention is going to be shifting to the future and the ancient stuff as well. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.